Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Shahab Paranj, composer and artistic director of the Vert Music Festival. We are pleased to have our first webinar series in 2021, and today we have a discussion with two guest speakers, Alexander Lieberman, composer and educator, and also composer,
Shahab, you muted yourself.
Sorry. How did I do that? Should I start from the beginning or it was just stopped in the middle? Okay. Through this webinar, my colleague at Vert Thomas Pierre, will join me to continue this conversation with our guests. We are hoping this informal discussion will be useful and meaningful for everyone. I emphasize on informal conversation and discussion because I feel sometimes we as a musician and educator are stuck in and swamped in academia framework, and we don't have a chance to develop an informal conversation about the matters that is important for us. So we are hoping this webinar series in many ways is accessible for everyone and gives an opportunity to those who does not have a chance to sharing their thoughts and ideas somewhere else. A little about the festival. The Vert is an annual new music festival for performers and composers in Franche-Comté, France. It is located in east part of France, focused on promoting collaborative relationship between composer and performers to create a new works. Each composer is paired with performers and ensemble, and they collaborate through the creation, premiere, and recording of new works. We are hoping this webinar series is actually helping us to get a better result for what we are aiming for those new works. Over the past few years, we had a chance to meet many great artists and wonderful musicians at the festival from all over the world. Each project at the festival established a friendship, as I am experiencing myself with so many great musicians now. So we become like a family, and this encourages us and the musicians to follow each other's activity, to think about more meaningful project. I think if I remember correctly, it was 6 months ago or more than that, that I saw the first transcription of Alexander's on the internet. And many of you know how viral these videos become. And I thought to myself, this is very interesting because this is very technical, and it's actually very challenging for some people to transcribe these sounds. But I see that this attention comes from a lot of non-musicians also. So I thought, we have to observe this and we need to talk about this basically. And, music of many different cultures around the world have some kind of connection to the world of animals, especially bird singing. This connection is either spiritually, philosophically, or directly music related. You can find many examples like in China, Far East Indian culture, or where I come from, Persian culture. One example is I can give you is that the bird, particularly nightingale is not only all over the literature and talks about the relationship with music, but also nightingale singing is related to how Persian classical singers sing. In fact, one of the important techniques for singers, tahrir, which is kind of the glutal vibration technique, is influenced by singing of nightingale. Basically, these techniques imitate what nightingale does and sing. And then in Western classical music, of course, we have composers who are like influenced by this spiritually and musically. Camille Saint-Saëns, Stravinsky's like Firebird, Franz Schubert, The Trout, The Red Pony Suite by Copland, Korsakov, Fight of the Bumblebees, Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky, Strauss, Nightingale, and George Crumb, and many other composers. And of course, we have Messiaen, who took it to another level, and he basically spiritually and musically was influenced by birds singing. So with this introduction, I would like to invite my dear friend Alexander Lieberman to introduce himself, and then I'm going to have some question for him.
Okay. Thanks, Shahab, for the introduction, and thank you to Du Vert à l'Infini, the music festival, for having me here. It is the first time I'm actually speaking about those transcriptions in that context, so I'm very excited about this. So about myself, I am a French-German composer, and I did my undergraduate here in Berlin at the Music University Hans Eisler, my bachelor's, which was actually in music theory, and with a major in composition arrangement. And after that, I went to Juilliard to do my master's in music composition, where I had the chance to study with great composers like Samuel Adler and Stephen Stuckey. And right now I'm enrolled in the doctoral program at Manhattan School of Music, where I am hopefully, graduating in this year. Yeah, hopefully. So I'm writing my dissertation on Schulhoff.
That's fantastic. I think it's better if I just ask you all the question. I think you can cover all of them maybe in like your presentation. So the first question is, how did you start these transcriptions? Was it a project or was just for fun? How did you initiate writing this series of transcriptions? And my second question is, in what extent these transcriptions are different from other things you have done in the frame of musicianship work, and how challenging was these transcriptions? And you could tell us a little about the process of these transcriptions, and also how is this transcription influencing your own composition, your music? And at the end, I wanted to know where this is going with, what is your mission for transcribing all these, sounds? And you could probably tell us a little about the other composers' transcriptions, not the music, just the transcription. And then, of course, we probably have more questions for you.
All right. So when the pandemic happened, exactly 1 year ago when it started, I was in New York, and from one day to the other, I was in Berlin. And during the first lockdown in May, I had a little bit more time on my hands than usually, and I stumbled across a video of a dog playing the piano and howling at the same time. And I was so fascinated by it, just because the dog was trying to reach the pitch it was playing on the piano. So it raised a lot of questions, like, is a dog consciously doing that, or is it pure coincidence? And, I challenged myself, I could write it down on sheet music. So I just wrote this transcription down and saw that it is fascinating to see this howl contouring the C, because it was apparently in C major. So yeah, and then, doing that, I started thinking, there are other animals out there, and animals I presumably knew, but whose call I actually didn't know that well. So I stumbled on another video, and that was really the turning point. It was a humpback whale singing. And it was a really spine-tingling experience, because I know humpback whales. I've never seen one in real, but I know what they look like. I know what they sound like, but I never heard them in that context, like focusing on the song as a song. So, and maybe it's because I've been teaching ear training for the past 5 years that I heard it differently too. So I heard suddenly an augmented triad. I heard a leap of a tritone. I heard, things I have to deal with every day. So I transcribed this whale song, and that's when everything really started, and also the problems I encountered. So let me share with you this transcription I did here. So here you have it, and it already is. When I look back at what I did, it's not really good. And the point is, what is not really good about it is that I was kind of still very naive to think that, animals do not sing. They do not sing in our parameters of music. They do not sing in key signatures. They do not sing in time signatures. They do not, bar lines are non-important for them. So in many ways, this transcription puts it in a cultural framework that is not fair to the animal, right? You can see here that I have written it in a 4/4 time signature, and I wouldn't do that anymore. The second issue I found is, there's a lot of limitations in those for us, like just phenomenologically speaking, or biologically speaking, like our auditive capacities are going from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz if we're lucky, and the older we get, the more limited we are in the frequencies we hear. But what do you do with a humpback whale that can sing up to 24,000 hertz? Like, are you going to notate that down up there? Like, what are you going to do? And recently scientists have found out that seals reach 50,000 hertz. I mean, wow, that just shows how limited we are too. And above 4,200 hertz anyway, we cannot really discern pitches anymore. If you think about the highest pitch on the piano, which is C8, it's 4,200 hertz or something. And even if you try to discern the difference between B7 and C8, the two highest note of the piano, like, it's really complicated. So everything that goes above it are pitches, but not the ones we're gonna really use. So in many ways, this transcription, the pitches are correct, or at least a little bit, but there are limitations. So the next transcriptions I did was a nightingale. And now I want to speak a little bit about the process. So let me share it with you. Here you go. And as you can see, I already eliminated the time signatures. I took out the bar lines, which is much fairer in a way to the animal. And I also didn't have it as a continuous line going through. So I had phrases marked here with the rehearsal numbers, 1, 2, 3. So that allowed me to look at those phrases individually. Now to the process. The process is divided in 3 steps, basically. And the most difficult step is the beginning. It is where to start. And there you already have a lot of questions arising up. So let's look at the Uirapuru transcriptions I did. So the 4/4 time signature is not fair. But here I had a dilemma, and it is how to start a transcription, right? So you have a rhythm that goes like da da ba ba da ba da ba ba, and you might hear it that way, but I really had a problem because for me, this note was much more accentuated than the first one. So for me, the downbeat would have actually been, or the strong beat would have been on that note. It's like da da ba ba dum ba dum ba ba. But then I would end up on an offbeat for the last note, which was not what I was hearing. So in that case, you really face a dilemma of how you actually hear the transcription, right? How are you going to notate this? So one way would have been to consider the smallest common denominator, like the 8 notes, and mark them down individually. But you would have gotten into crazy notation, especially if you consider the triplets and other notation. So this just shows, and my way of hearing a transcriptions puts me in a cultural surrounding, how I learned to listen to music, how I grew up, and so forth. So there are lots of problematic aspects alone to put it into sheet music, and of how hearing this, and if I write it that way, it will influence your way of hearing the bird as well. If you look at this, you're gonna hear it as 2/8 notes here, and not as a kind of an upbeat, how I actually heard in the beginning, like ba ba, like that. Yeah, let me clear those drawings here. So the process, once I decided where to start, is that I do the rhythm first, always the tempo first. So in order to facilitate this process, I use tempi that are, either 60 BPM, 90 or 120, because that way, when I know that it's really complicated, some parts, I can always extract the sounds individually. So let me explain. For example, at a tempo of 60 BPMs, so 60 beats per minute, we have one beat every second. And if you have one beat every second and you struggle at beat 4, you can extract the seconds 4 to 5 and focus attentively on that part. So that is one way to get around really complicated rhythm. And once that is down, I have to map out the notes, which to me is the most fun part, because, and for that I use my ears. I have a keyboard, and when it gets really complicated, then I use some software to slow down the recordings. And yeah, with all these complexities that you have in those songs, the range, the melody, the rhythm, I came to the conclusion that it will never be possible to write a sound found in nature, so those chords, with 100% accuracy. So to me, it is a sad truth, but also, I try to see the beauty in it too, because it just shows how limited our systems is, and how versatile nature can be. It's a fascinating, it's fascinating.
Right. I just have a quick question for you regarding the rhythm here. I think the challenging part, more than anything, could be the rhythm. And as you showed me, I think you started a little conservative to try to put everything in that frame. What is music, especially Western music. Do you think when you're going farther with this, you have to come up with other solutions in terms of how you approach writing these rhythms? Forget about the meter sometimes, forget about the because this is a different language, it's a different zone, and this is exactly what I am experiencing when I write music from Iran, Persian music, because there is no meter sometimes, and I have to come up with new system. So do you think about that you have to approach it a little different for the rhythm part?
Yeah, so the entire evolution since the beginning has been, consistently I've tried to be more truth to what I hear. But at the same time, there's this ambiguity, this fine line, because I also want them to be approachable by musicians or by anyone. So the goal of that is also to, for someone to look at this and to reproduce the sounds on their instruments. So and I think this is part of what makes them also maybe, more fun. Yeah, like
Right.
you can look at this and you can actually take your violin and reproduce it. Yeah, so there's this very fine line between, trying to be as truth as possible to what you hear, and also to make it accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And the other realization and problem is, of course, the fact that, again, animals do not sing in a well-tempered system. Like, and for that, I also limited myself, because I use syntonic comma notation, which is, you can see it here, the one with the arrow going down. and which normally describes a variation, a deviation, an alteration of the pitch by 21.5 cents of the notes.
Right.
But that is not what I indicate exactly in those transcriptions. So this, these notes are not going to be 21 cents lower than indicated, but for me, they're just mapping out the notes or showing in which direction the pitch is going.
Right.
And so this is really important. Otherwise, there are so many microtonal different accidentals that I can use for 50 cents, 75 cents, and so forth. It would be less fun to me, because for me, it's just to show in which direction they go and to make them accessible.
Also, David mentions regarding, I think he meant changing meter in this particular expert could be also something that you could try. Did you try that change a meter as well?
Yeah, so absolutely. I've tried a lot. But this one dates, I think, from September. So I've been doing this for 10 months now, and there has been a constant change in how I approach those. So this has been kind of an older one, and I tried to stay 4/4 throughout and just write them how I hear it. Absolutely, a change of meter could have been an option, but later on, I think this came a little bit later, I completely eliminated any kind of meter. So I had a common beat, which is quarter notes, go through and divide them by phrases of the animal. So rehearsal number 2 happened later.
Right. Since I'm sorry to interrupt you, I think since we talk about David's comments, it's better if I invite him actually to this conversation, if he would like to explain what he meant by changing meter, and he has something to say about this expert as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, Alexander, pleased to meet you. And these transcriptions are so impressive. But I guess my first question for you is, what is the goal of the transcriptions? So if the goal is to be completely neutral, then I suppose the 4/4 transcriptions are okay. But if they're meant to be truly representative of the way you process the sound, then, just confining the conversation to the meters, changing meters strike me as perfectly appropriate. You've got a series of eighth notes, and they're all grouped into quarter notes, but then you've got an extra one before what you perceive as a downbeat. So, are you being true to the bird, or are you being true to your perception of the bird?
Yeah, that is I love that question. So thank you. I probably both. And this fine line I try to reach, and I would not do the transcription of the Uirapuru that I showed the same way again, like not at all. So just to show you this nightingale that came just 1 month afterwards is like completely different, where I try to be much more true to the nightingale than to how I perceive it. So accents appear, but there's no bar line. There's no hierarchy between the beats. There's no beats at all. So yeah, and the mission, you named the mission. So in the beginning, when I started doing this, they were just simple ear training challenges, but I slowly noticed how much more there's behind, when Greenpeace started to share those transcriptions, and other, Orchester des Wandels, a German orchestra that is concerning about climate change, started also to share them. I noticed that there's much more behind it. And actually what I try to do now with them, and that's why I also research a lot about those animals whenever I post them. I rely on online resources, I read scientific articles, and I have encyclopedias. So what I try to do, there are 3 missions I see now. So the first one is to make people more aware of some species, and that you can get more aware of species if you share something in common with them. So let me explain. For example, you're a musician and you have never heard of a nightingale before, but suddenly you see that, and you might actually, say, wow, that's really impressive, and play those transcriptions or look at them. And suddenly it makes you aware of a species you maybe didn't care, or you were previously unaware of. So that is the first mission. The second one is, in doing all my research, I was amazed on how much those birds, how much we share in common with other cultures we presumably don't have anything in common with. For example, I am in Berlin right now, and I grew up in Berlin. And in the summertime, I'm surrounded by nightingales, and they are part of my culture. Of my, they made me in a way. And when I read about nightingales, and that's to learn that they spend half of the year in countries south of the Sahara deserts, in countries from West Africa to Uganda, I was just simply amazed. Suddenly I share something fundamentally important with people from Uganda. I didn't realize that earlier. When Shahab mentions that in Persian music, nightingales are so important. This is I think this is extremely important just to connect us as a human species too. To use those birds or animals as a common denominator for to connect as a binding element. And lastly, I try to make also people maybe more aware of, or attract people more to the avant-garde or contemporary music scene. A lot of people hearing those, realize, countless other comments of people saying, this is contemporary music. This is so abstract. And some of those are extremely abstract. I don't know, Shahab, if we have time, maybe we should listen to this Nightingale transcriptions.
Yes, please.
So, okay, let me just open the file. Let's hear it. Okay, can you all see that?
No. Yes, now we can see it.
Okay, so let me play it.
This is amazing, Alex. And I see how it is different from the first expert you showed us.
Yeah, so to come back to this last part, I mean, people who have fundamentals, as a general opinion that they don't like contemporary classical music or avant-garde music, might approach it completely differently. To go to an avant-garde concert if you know that Olivier Messiaen, George Crumb were inspired by birds too, and maybe be more open-minded about modern music in general, if you know that it is as abstract in nature.
Right. I wanted to invite Professor Lefkowitz to talk about his experience, as he called himself, bird watcher for a while. And then I'm going to have more questions for you, Alex, that come back to you again. Please welcome Professor Lefkowitz.
Thank you, Shahab. Alexander, if I can ask you to go back to the Urapuru.
Yeah.
So one of the things that struck me, I've done a few transcriptions, nothing like this. But for example, if you look at that measure 3, the second line beginning with that high B flat, playing it down an octave, if I'm reading these notes correctly, aside from the intonation issues that the high B and the high B natural, that some of those are out of tune, there's an awful lot of what my type of music theorist would call O and sixes. So for example, C, C sharp, F sharp, or C, C sharp, G which sounds so awfully dissonant. It's got minor seconds and tritones. But this passage, so beginning with a G sharp at the end of that measure, um, that is exactly that harmony. And the very last notes of that, again, intonation aside, we have so many of these C sharp F sharps, 016s, these minor seconds and the tritones and tritones. I've been watching birds all my life, but I never really thought about them musically until I was 21 and working in an internship as a lawyer with some lawyers in London. But I spent most of the summer attending proms concerts and learning about new music. I was just starting out in composition, and I attended this talk that was given by some guy named Witold Lutosławski. Didn't really quite realize who this giant was when I was there at age 21. And I very brazenly asked him a question because I was sure, this thing or this thing, those were all natural and good and right and represented everything that humanity stood for. And I said to Mr. Lutosławski, how do you respond to people who say that tonal music is built upon natural intervals and atonal is not? And without missing a beat, he said, birds don't sing tonal music. And he went on and talked about how all intervals are natural and he loves perfect fifths as much as anybody else and blah, blah, blah. But it's only really been hitting me recently when I started doing some similar transcriptions, as I said, that I kept on finding tritones all over. It's kind of a surprise. Alexander, have you found that to be the case?
So I found everything, like, compound intervals, compound tritones, everything. But what I encountered, which is extremely interesting, is so I read some scientific articles about the song of the Urapuru, and it mentioned that songbirds sing with what they call eventual variety. And eventual variety is basically when a bird sings a song and repeats it by changing one little element or two, or three, but then continuously repeats it like the Urapuru does. And at one point, after several repetitions, it would move on to a completely new song and start over the process. And I was so amazed reading that because, in classical music, what is the difference between eventual variety and developing variations, right? Like, I mean, when you look at a composer like Brahms, you have a motivic cell unit in the beginning that stands for the entire, for a big portion of the composition. And that can be traced back to it. And in the same way, so finding this correlation was, to me, like an eye-opening experience. And so I have found some crazy similarities.
Right. So there's so much stuff that contemporary composers do which seems so strange to people who are brought up on Western classical music or popular music. And because it's strange, it must be wrong. But there's nothing wrong about it. Developing variations is very natural, very common, very typical. And repetition, I mean, maybe we can talk about how integral serialism is a little bit artificial, perhaps. But repetition until you move on, just as you said, developing variations is a very natural thing for any being on this planet. So I want to present two. Well, for me, when I transcribe bird songs, it's for musical purposes, to see if I can get inspiration to use it in a piece of music, and if there's time, I'll share a piece of my music. But I wanted to share two observations that sort of run against that. One is Messiaen. you can very easily read that in order to make the bird songs accessible to human ears, Messiaen did things like augment the intervals. So a quarter tone would turn into a semitone, a series of 4 quarter tones would turn into 4 semitones, and he, of course, would augment the intervals. In the end, I just looked at the first couple of pages of Oiseaux Exotiques at the piano part, and I know the sound of a Baltimore Oriole, and it's not what Messiaen wrote. And I mean, what he wrote is for the Baltimore Oriole is sort of generic birdsong like this. Fine, I'm sure you can find that sound somewhere in the Baltimore Oriole's vocabulary. But also he transcribed the white-crowned laughing stock of the Himalayas. And I just to see if I could find what he transcribed, I listened to a whole bunch of white-crowned laughing stock recordings. And I'm sure there's a lot more to their vocabulary than what I listened to, but I couldn't find anything that sounded like Messiaen. Which makes me sort of suspicious. And then if I can rib a friend of mine who's on this call, Thomas said a set of poems about Blackbird. Was that Wallace Stevens?
Wallace Stevens, yes. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird.
Right. And Thomas used a recording of a blackbird. And the truth is that when I listened to it, the moment I heard the recording, it took me completely out of the music, because what he had was not any blackbird that Wallace Stevens had ever heard. The blackbird has a song that is like, or a call anyway. And Thomas had found this beautiful song of a European blackbird, which is actually a thrush. And it's no surprise, should come as little surprise to those who love birds. Thrushes, their songs are very often transcribed. I listened to the Swainson's thrush. The piece that I'll share with you is based upon a hermit thrush. The laughing stock, the white-crowned laughing stock of the Himalayas is a type of thrush. They have very, very musical songs. They're beautiful, but they're not the North American blackbird. So I have sort of an ingrown skepticism of using birdsong in music, actually using birdsong in music. And a small aspect of that, Alexander, your transcriptions, there are so many ledger lines, aside from the fact that it's so difficult to read. They're so high, you know? Their musical utility way up there is a little bit limited, right?
Yeah. So that's also one of the problems, I encounter, because on one hand, I want to show how high they really are, so even have the visual component of it. And on the other side, when it gets really high, like for the seal transcription I did, sometimes, I had to use ledger lines. So this is one of the points that was recurrent also in the entire comments I got. It's like, use the octave sign and so forth. I have mixed feelings about it. So yes and no. Sometimes, for me, I can visually see how high something is better when I look at this like that than having an octave sign. But of course, if you want to perform it, play it, then octave signs are much, much better. Yeah, and to come back to the transcriptions of Mission or Mission using birds, I totally agree. Sometimes it's you don't know what to think about it. Le merle noir, okay, and then you try to find it. And I actually have a page of a book of William Gardiner, who is the only composer, scientist I know of who transcribed for the sake of transcription. And let me share you this page of his book called, here I have it, The Music of Nature. So it was published in 1832. And this is the page of the book. And look at that. I don't know if you can see it well, but you have the thrush, as you mentioned. You have different ones. Let's go through it. But as you can see, they're kind of, so when we speak about the truth of, being truth to the animal or being truth to the composer, I think him using a key like D major here, or him using bar lines is a little bit, not outdated, but very centralized, like culturally centralized in a way. And I think some of them are hilarious. Like, look at the horse. Like, I mean, like it's kind of funny. And also like the cow. I mean, I don't really know what to think about that, especially when you read the pages beforehand, him explaining what they are. For example, he says that the cuckoo here, all the cuckoos he heard were in D major, where, when I read this, I'm a little bit skeptical, like you, David, especially when the one I did. So there was a great reed warbler and a cuckoo was in C major. So the one I heard was in C, but the one that William Gardner heard was in D. So I don't know, yes.
Alexander, it's very clear that with global warming, the cuckoos have gone flat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that must be it. Yeah, especially, throughout the transcription, it gets flatter and flatter. So global warming is happening fast.
That's
really
right.
Fast.
Exactly. Can you go back to that the 19th century image? So one of the things that I've noticed, I used to do a chickadee song, and that major second is not exactly a major second, and if I nailed it, they would respond to me, and if I was more than a little bit off, they would ignore me.
Wow.
Which is kind of funny, and I think they were pretty consistent on pitch. So I can actually imagine that this guy heard only cuckoos that were all on D major. Not that all cuckoos are, but that the ones that he heard were all only on D major. But then there's others, like the laughing stock, that'll respond to anything. You feed it a song and it'll give it back. But the other thing that strikes me, so the blackbird, I listened to a lot of, I've heard a lot of birds that have this sort of sound. And you also have something like that up at the top. It said another, which I guess is another nightingale.
Yeah.
Or
whether it's trill at the end.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of these calls that are just sort of really typical, and not unique to another nightingale, which in some ways I think is sort of a good license for composers to use them as they see fit. As long as they're not saying that is the call of the white-crested laughingstock of the southern Himalayas, but inspired by, I think it's okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, David, would you like to talk a little about your own music and the relation to birds singing?
Sure. If I can share the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got it.
Cool.
As I think I told you, I've been a bird watcher my entire life, but actually I've never really used birdsong until this. This is part of a set of 10 preludes and fugues that I wrote this past year. This was my 2020 project. And for these preludes and fugues, I developed a different mode for each prelude and fugue. This one, there were a lot of tritones and perfect fourths. So I was just sort of fooling around with this. And I wasn't sure what to do with it, and finally it struck me, it sounded like a bird. So I transcribed bits and pieces not anywhere near as systematically as Alexander has, but bits and pieces of a hermit thrush, which struck me as really perfect since I was busy being a hermit, rarely leaving my home. And I wrote this. It's about 2.5 minutes long. You can tell me, Shahab, how much of it I should play. You can just sort of start waving your
Oh,
hand.
we have time. Please go on.
Oh, okay. So here it is.
That was beautiful.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
You know, the one thing that I love about this is in certain spots, like where is it? Right over here, I've got a little canon, which is so much like what you hear in nature. You know, whether because they're far enough apart that the birds aren't paying attention to each other, or they're close enough that they're competing with each other. So this sort of thing, you hear that in nature a lot. And I've been trying to decide, though, how I feel about this. And I'm going back and forth. Because it's so un-bird-like. And yet it feels to me at the same time like a kind of fascinating transformation of this sound. It's really growly and intense, but it's, I don't know. Alexander, I'd love to get your
well, congratulations. I really, really liked it. To me, it sounded really like this conversation, you know, or like a multitude of birds happening, especially if you mentioned that, you know, you have this canon at some point, and that's what we hear in nature. Absolutely. And, you know, once you know that, it makes it's so fun to just follow the piece. And I think the element, of putting this into the bass register, I think it's just a wonderful idea, because it raises your question right away. You're like, whoa, what kind of bird is that? So
A scary one.
no, subcontrabas bird. Like, I don't know, like it's so I like it a lot, yeah.
Well, thank you.
And it's all about this mentality, I think, when you go to concerts and it sounds abstract, but it is actually all around us.
Right.
It is all around us all the time. And when you mention also that, it happens in canon or everywhere around us that birds imitate each other. I recently read also about humpback whales, and I was so fascinated to read that they sing in unison miles away too. Being miles apart from each other, humpback whales sing the same song in unison.
Right.
That is, so even, unison, we think about it, the simplest form happens in nature too, everything. So, yeah.
By the way, Abigail Sanders posted something really fascinating. The pitch of blue whales has decreased gradually by an octave over the last 40 years. Wow. Is that a harbinger of something bad, or is it just something that happens?
I think it's because you mentioned that the cuckoo went down a whole step, right? So if I can jump in just a second to reference a couple of questions that were posted in the chat. Once going back to your process, Alexander, Gianfranco was asking about the perception of microtonal pitches, and what particular, you mentioned that you're using a software, which one, or if you are using spectrograms to clarify this. But also there's this question also again with from Abigail, which I think it's very interesting, about if your ultimate intention or part of the purpose of doing this is that musicians perform those transcriptions, and if you would be interested to reference the original recording from where those transcriptions were made, or it's something that at certain point, like I don't know, like for example, we've seen in David's fugue, where the super big and low bird comes at some point in the piece, and this is not anymore referencing a real bird song, right?
So what's the question, Thomas?
So the question is that if you would like musicians to reference the recording from where the transcription was made in a certain way, or it's something that once the transcription is done is something that can be, it's just that you got this source of inspiration to create this transcription, and this material now becomes something different. Like in a way, and referencing the mention that you did to my piece, definitely I grew up in Europe, so I took the influence from what I thought was my closest blackbird, but I never intended to really, recreate so precisely the bird song, rather than just get some inspiration and use it as a way to develop this piece, as a raw material from here, developing it.
Yeah. So speaking as a composer, and also especially as a composition teacher, I would advise caution, telling performers, listen to this recording and play like that. Because Alexander, I'm sure you can attest to this, your ears, the whole way you listen to sounds has probably changed completely. I've been doing some work with some students analyzing timbre, and suddenly we're no longer listening to pitch relationships. I'm listening to just how much noise is there? Is it 30% noise or 40% noise? So, musicians want to play their instruments. They don't want to change the way they're listening to the world. So as a composition teacher, I would caution, be very careful before you do that. And that's true even crossing styles. I've referenced klezmer clarinet style. I've said, play this like this. And I know that some people will, like this recording that you hear of some early 20th century klezmer clarinetist, and I know that some performers will just run away screaming. But it's good to have that information, tucked away in the very, very back of the score. Here's a recording that I listened to that you may want to listen to. Alexander, have you made music with your transcriptions?
So I have done one flute piece so far, which is based on the Wirapuru transcription. And yeah, that's it. So far, I actually enjoyed the process a lot to, do my own developing variation on that piece. So I tried taking motivic cell units, but the ones I chose and developing on it. That's it. But I plan to do more too. So.
Right. Well, for me, when you said you've chosen the motivic cell units that you want to work with, to me this is the main answer to the central question, Shahab, that you've been presenting to us this entire time, which is, as a composer, as a musician, take inspiration from nature. Don't try to copy nature. We're not birds. We don't sing like birds. We don't make music like birds. We don't hear music the way birds hear music. But to say, wow, that was crazy, run with it, So yes, I take inspiration from nature all over, but it's definitely filtered through my musical preferences.
Right. Regarding what you just said, I have it's a little philosophical question about the fact that these transcriptions, the composer is the animal, is a bird. And we know how people pay attention to these, transcriptions. I wanted to ask for you both, the fact that you just mentioned, David, if we have our training, we learn how to compose. Is it possible that somehow we put that aside and learn from these birds how they creative process? They don't think about creativity. They just probably communicate their event. I don't know what is that, but how we can go to that zone and compose like a bird?
Well, I know a little bit about how birds learn songs. Birds have an innate template of melodic shapes, of melodic figures that they recognize as coming from their own species. They don't have those shapes or melodies innately learned, but they have a template. And they'll say that thing that I just heard fits into my template, and that thing does not fit into my template. So the ones that they hear most loudly are probably going to be their dads nearby the nests singing. So they hear that very closely, and it fits in. From there, there's this gradual but limited range of variations for most birds. There's some birds like the mockingbird that we have all over Los Angeles that can learn songs from other birds, can imitate other songs. There's the myna and parrots as well. But for most birds, the creativity is really limited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the scientific article I read about the Wirapuru, they also analyzed I don't know how many Wirapurus, and they found that intervals that we perceive as perfect fifth or perfect fourth and octaves were the most used intervals for those specific birds, and that's why a lot of us perceive it as tonal in some way too. But that's one species, out of a multitude. So yeah, I guess there's a plethora of possibilities out there, and not only one.
Great, thank you. Thomas, would you please tell us, for the question we have in the chat room, and share the question
Well, the question about the performance, I already said it. There was this other one about the software and the spectrogram that you were using, software that you were using to for the transcriptions.
Yeah, so I don't use any spectrograms for it. I think that would be too much work, and that's not what I want to do. Otherwise, it would be also cheating a little bit. I mean, composers like us are not, that's why science relies on spectrograms to do their research and not on composers. Otherwise, we would all be working probably in laboratories. But yeah, so I don't use any. So I use some, but no spectrograms. I use Audacity, to slow down, to take a part off and then slow down the recording, and which is cool because it can maintain the pitch and slows it down, and then I can just by playing it figure out if the pitch is slightly lower or higher. So yes, I do that, but no spectrograms. And what was the other question?
The other question, we already discussed this about the performance, if musicians should or not reference or listen to the recording from where the transcription was made, but we already talked about this a little bit.
Okay.
Well, I did. Alexander didn't. If you want to say something about that.
Well, I don't intend those transcriptions to be played. I think it just goes back to the mission I mentioned before, to show how abstract they can be. Sometimes I have friends playing those transcriptions just to show how they actually sound played on instruments. That's it. Yeah, and our other, Shahab also mentions the composer aspect, who's the owner. So there's something really funny going on because I registered all my transcriptions to the German ASCAP. Let's see what happens, because I don't know how they are gonna deal with that. I have a performer, and it's been heard countless of times. And nobody tells me not to use animal sounds from nature or to mention as copyright. So I think we're entering a gray zone there, because I have no answer to that, and I'm curious what's the GEMA is gonna do. So that's gonna be in December.
Can I say a little more in response to Shahab's question about learning how to create like composers? So first of all, I'm not sure that the premise that Alexander was just referring to, that Shahab asked, is right, that the birds are the composers because of their really limited ability to create new songs, except for a very few limited number of species. But I do think that we can learn how to compose from birds in some senses. So there was an NPR report last summer about the white-crowned sparrow. 10, 15 years ago, the song The White-Crowned Sparrow was, you see it written in bird books as, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada," or "Old Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody." And then somewhere starting in the Pacific Northwest, the birds started changing. Probably it started with one, I'm sorry about that. It started with one male who sang, "Oh, sweet Canada," or "Oh, sweet Canada."
Oh.
And the females must have loved this. Wow, check that guy out. He's shortening it. And it has now spread across most of North America. And the "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada" is mostly a thing of the past. But in here, I think that we can see some general principles that for me are really important, because I started composing at the tail end of the era of serialism. Everybody was writing serial music, and you had to learn how to write serial music. And if you were doing things like, minimalism was just, oh God, what are those idiots doing? But so the principles of lengthening, right, which Alexander talked about, variation, and also shortening, but most especially repetition. We can, and we should feel free. We should feel free. We should feel free. We should feel free to repeat. There's
Great.
my diatribe. The song of the Lefkowitz bird.
Great. Thank you, David. So thank you both. If you have anything to close this with your presentation, your talk, from what you said, I think this was very useful and very educational for a lot of us. But also I'm thinking that we should continue this kind of conversation. It is very important because it's just opening new chapters for, especially for composers, to how they can approach, how they sometimes unlearn from what they have learned. They spend a lot of times to be in the academia and learn composition technique, but sometimes you could have a different approach, and Birds is a great example that you can learn from it, actually. So do you have anything to say, Alex, for your ending your presentation?
Well, I'd say that, being in big cities, Berlin, New York, for the past couple of years, and most cultural institutions that we're surrounded are in big cities, and that's not where, a humpback whale just flows around or where you have animals. So I think we have been in the past a little bit alienated, from nature. So we have been taken away from it to some instance. And I think this is why, one of the reasons why suddenly, these humpback whales gave me the chills. Suddenly they're out there, and why didn't I hear this earlier? I'm just suddenly like, wow, like what have I missed? And up to now, my Instagram feed is full of humpback whales. It's like, I don't know, I love those. And I think maybe, to focus more on this natural aspect. So as Professor Lefkowitz said, we notice how much we can actually, what is out there and what we can do, repetition out there, all of it is there to some extent, and that we should not limitate ourselves, being like, I write like that, so that's it. But being like, wow, I want to write a piece that's based on repetition. Yeah, you'll find it anyways, like that's out there. There shouldn't be rules like restricting you to a certain genre or something like that. I hope that closes it nicely.
Yeah, thank you. And Professor Lefkowitz, please, anything if you want to share.
Well, mostly I want to say what Alexander said. Yes, take inspiration from nature, especially if it helps us all become more sensitive to nature. That's all to the best. So definitely do that. But I also want to say something sort of against learning from, or the opposite, learning in an opposite way from birds. I talked about the templates and the limitations on bird songs and most bird songs. One of the things about us is that we don't have templates, right? Yes, it's true that if you don't learn a second language before adolescence, it's very, very difficult to learn a second language later on, but we can, right? We don't have to be stuck in, if you're writing tonal music, you can write atonal music. If you're writing atonal music, you can write tonal music. Don't feel like there are limitations either imposed on you from without or from within on the music that you write. That's for the composers amongst us. Yeah. And Shahab and Tomas, thank you so much for having us. And Alexander,
yeah, thank you.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you both. Thank you for coming to this conversation and give us all this valuable thoughts. And thank you all the participants. So if you want, you can actually write your email address in this chat, so we can for the later webinars or any other events, we can send you an email. The closest one is going to be the call for a score for composers and video artists collaboration. We're going to update that in our website. And that's all, right, Tomas?
That's right. We will be announcing the call for scores very soon in the next week or so. And nothing, just thank again Alexander and David for joining us today, and everybody who participated in it. And yeah, I hope that we'll have another one soon.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
So thank you again. Tomas and Shahab, I'll be in touch.
Yes, we'll be in touch. Take care.
Bye.
Rojin, would you please take care of the email addresses?
Yes, that's what I'm doing.
Thank you.
Just do not close the meeting.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Can you just stop the live streaming on YouTube, please?